Welcome to Up Next Recaps, and today we're going through a 2016 horror movie called Let Her Out. The movie begins with a guy and a lady sleeping with each other. The lady looked uninterested in being with the guy as she gets service when it all ends. Moments later, a man in a hat drives to the motel. He knocks on the door and gets down to the business without her willingness from earlier, even after she says she was closed for the night. When he finishes his business, he gets back to his car and drives himself to his place. Later on, she finds out she was pregnant with someone's kid. She walks through her motel room and feels some pains in her stomach. She then picks up a pair of scissors and finishes off just outside her room. Room service arrives to clean up when she sees the lady half dead on her bed. She screams and runs for help. After the movie credits roll in, there's a time jump to 23 years later. On a bright afternoon, Helen, an average young girl, is seen riding a bike through town. She gets to Roman's apartment, takes the lift to his room and delivers his package to him. Roman compliments her look and collects his package. Then he invites her in to see his painting of her. Helen is so impressed that she nearly kisses Roman. The kiss happens but is cut short as Helen says she can't do that with Roman. Helen gives her the painting and lets her out of his apartment. By nightfall, Helen talks to her friend about the painting, and her friend chastises her for sitting in the room where her mother took her own life years ago. Helen just ignores her and gives Molly a gift she stole from her house when she was younger. Molly checks out the bracelet and listens to her friend talk about how lonely she feels at all. Molly acts like the good friend she is and comforts Helen. As they giggle, Ed, Molly's trainer, calls her and she leaves for her training. Helen is about to leave the motel when she's hit by a car. She passes out and the owner of the car takes her to the hospital. The next day, the doctor tells Molly that her friend sustained a made head injury and that they're unsure whether or not Helen would be fine. When Helen comes to, Molly tells her she'd be fine. Soon Helen is discharged and her friends throw her welcome back home party, which she seemed to enjoy or not. Molly enters Helen's room during the party only to see her painting it again. She urges her friend to come downstairs and enjoy the party for real. Helen follows suit and meets Ed. Ed introduces himself and throws Helen a compliment which she doesn't take well. Eddie is unfazed and puffs in some coke before going to put a wonderful performance in front of everyone. Later on, the real party starts and everyone dances to the tunes. In the next scene, Helen finds herself riding her bike to a parking lot. Thankfully, she avoids getting hit by an oncoming car. She worms out of danger. Then she calls her friend asking her how she got there. Molly says she doesn't know how and just cuts the call. Helen leaves the parking lot later on. By nightfall, Helen's alone in her room when she hears the ladies moan from the other room. She checks out the eerie drawing she was scribbling on her board and destroys it. The next day, Helen does her morning workout before hitting the shower. While making up, she receives a call from Molly, who invites her to an audition later that evening. Helen accepts it and checks out her broken arm from the car accident in the motel the other night. She then washes her face and sees a silhouette in the shower she just came out from. She walks closer, opens it and finds nothing there. Then she looks back and sees a creature staring back at her. A series of images flashed by and Helen finds herself in front of her friends. She removes her towels and runs back when she finds out where she was. Molly follows her friend to the bathroom and promises to take her to the doctor the next day. Helen agrees and closes the bathroom door. The next day, Helen and Molly talk with Dr. Headley, who tells her they need to do an MRI scan of her brain to check out the affected areas. After the scan, Helen hits the road and returns to the motel she was injured the other day. Helen opens the door to the room. Her mom died 23 years ago and sits on the bed. In there she hears a voice calling to her alarm. Helen checks under the bed and sees someone there. Later on, Helen receives a call from Dr. Headley, who tells to come to the hospital at that moment. Upon getting there, Helen finds out her mother was supposed to have twins. However, the twin died in her and was absorbed into Helen instead of the mother. Now she literally has some genetic material stuck in her brain. Dr. Headley advises she's booked for surgery, but Helen says she'd like to think about it first. Then something happens at that moment that causes Helen to change her mind. Moments later, Helen leaves the apartment on her way home. She listens to someone else's story with the same condition she had. That night she discusses her surgery with her friend Molly and tells her about her survivor's guilt. Molly cheers her up by taking a photo of the two of them and leaving later. Helen giggles and gets back to her apartment. In her room, she hears the shower running and finds out that one of her paintings was already back on the wall. She pulls it off and finds out there was no one in the shower. Then she sees the painting back up again, picks it and meets up with Romans. Upon getting to his apartment, she finds a recording of herself tying Rome into a bed and doing something to him. She then sees the whole room scattered and writes to an alleyway where she destroys her computer. As she's about to leave, she throws up and pulls out some hair strands from her mouth. Thankfully, Helen gets back home in one piece and takes a shower. In the shower, she has flashbacks to her time with Roman and snaps out of it almost immediately. Then she sees the words "I'm coming" written on her mirror. She goes to her bedroom and finds the painting on her bed again. This time she throws the painting in the trash and ties herself to her bed. Helen falls asleep and has more flashbacks than usual. She wakes up in the middle of the night with the restraints off and winces at the pain she was feeling. She removes her bed cover and finds a pocket blade there. Then she sees the painting again and is interrupted by your friend. Upon opening the door, Helen is reminded that Molly's show was starting in an hour. She apologizes for being late for preparations and tells her friend she'd be right there. Helen gets back to her room and puts on something for friend's show. Before leaving, she feels some pain yet again on her hand but leaves anyway. On her way to the audition, she feels some pain in her arm. She holds it in and flashes back to the good time she had with Roman. Helen continues moving till she enters the backstage to a horror movie's opening night. She walks us through the props and stops at a corner. Then she rips open the cast put in your arm and pulls out the threads used in selling the wound shot. After removing the thread, she finds a finger in the wound, removes it and cleans herself up. Then she gets back to the street and sees Eddie, who asks her what was wrong. Eddie tells her he's in love with her and Helen just ignores him. He then chastises and challenges her about what happened the previous night between them. Helen has no knowledge of what happened and is irritated at Ed's claims. After a heated argument between them, Ed is pinned to the wall and coerced into admitting that he's a boy. Upon doing that, Helen promises to give him her body. Eddie jumps at it and calls himself a little boy. Helen then orders him to take off his pants, which he does. Then she brings out her pocket blade and almost ribs out of his balls and makes her to release him, and she does so and walks away. Helen walks away from Ed and sees an apparition of her deceased twin in front of her. Helen tries to brush her off and is successful at the first try. However, as the scenery becomes eerier, Helen gets back to her house and stays there. She ties herself to the bed yet again and sleeps off. This time she has a nightmare of running from something later that night. Helen wakes up to see herself still tied to the bed. She gets out of her room and sees her friend sitting in the living room. Seeing as she's failed her friend, she rushes to apologize to her instead. Molly says Helen is sick and she needs help. Like Helen is just as confused, but Molly then shows her some incriminating painting Helen made of her in Eden to get into a heated argument with Molly, chastising Helen for scaring her boyfriend Ed. Helen tries explaining to her friend Ed was in trouble, but Molly threatens to call the police after finding out Helen used a knife to scare Ed. Helen freaks out and lets out a shout. Then it's almost like she switched personalities. Helen's deceased twin then takes over and nearly hurts her. Just as she's about to hurt her, Helen comes back on again. She runs to her room and urges Molly to escape from her. Molly follows her nonetheless, and it's almost hurt again when Helen changes personalities. Luckily, Helen changes back and runs to the streets. While on the road, Helen comes across an angry Eddie who brings out the knife from earlier to attack her. She runs to the subway and hides from Ed. Sadly, Ed catches her and assaults her. He pushes her on the ground and Helen transforms into her deceased twin. Moments later, she takes out Ed in the worst way possible. After finishing with him, she scribbled something on the ground and sits near Eddie. Then Melanie gets her body back and runs out of the subway and Ed's car. Meanwhile, Molly checks the photo she took herself and Helen. She finds out that Helen in the photo wasn't the real one and calls her friend. Upon picking up the phone, she tells her that she understands why she's acting that way and that she'd like to talk to her. Helen says she doesn't want to go near her friend as her sister was already taking over her. She cuts the call after telling Molly she had to take care of things. Molly quickly takes Helen's bike and traces her through town. Helen, on the other hand, drives to the same hotel her mother ended her life at and enters the room. There she takes some antidepressant pills and sleeps on the bed. Seconds later she transforms again. I don't know, fully transformed. Helen's sister looks herself in the mirror and promises to eliminate Helen that night. She breaks the mirror and transforms back to Helen, who slips her wrist. Watching the blood ooze out of her hand, Helen hears a familiar voice. She checks it out and finds her sister, who tells her she was going to meet her and her sister tries to free herself by taking over Helen's body, but Molly arrives just in time. She hears Helen screams from the room and sees her friend in the corner of the room. Helen tells her to run as fast as she could, but Molly says she's not going to leave her. Then Helen changes back to her sister and pulls out her own skin. After exposing her new flesh, she chases after Molly, who runs to the bathroom. Thankfully, she escapes through the window and into the garage. After a few silent steps, Molly gets to the car and enters it. Helen's sister follows suit and waits for Molly to make a mistake. When Molly gets out of the car, Helen's sister pursues her back inside. She manages to pin Molly down in the bathtub and squeeze her neck to near extinction. Molly struggles to pick up a shard of glass and take out her friend. Shortly afterwards, Molly checks out her dead friend to make sure she was really gone, backs up and picks up the necklace she and her friend shared when they were younger. In the next scene, it's morning time and Molly walks out of the motel room to her by the movie ends as she picks it up and runs.